The Mississippi River had swallowed 3 inches of Louisiana soil that spring, and with it any hope of a merciful season at Briar Hollow Plantation. The water crept through the lowlands like a living thing, turning the cane fields into fever-breeding swamps and the cotton rows into graveyards of rotted boles. The air itself seemed diseased, thick with mosquitoes and the stench of decomposition that no amount of lime could mask. Martha had seen 53 summers in bondage, though her body bore the marks of twice that many. Her back was a topography of scars, each one a story she'd stopped telling decades ago. Her hands, gnarled as cypress roots, could no longer straighten fully, permanently curved from a lifetime of picking, scrubbing, and carrying. But her eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, still held something that made even the overseers look away. Something that suggested she saw farther than most, into places where the living shouldn't look. She moved through the slave quarters like a ghost, her presence both comforting and unsettling to the others. The younger slaves sought her for remedies, poultices for infected wounds, teas for women's troubles, whispered prayers for protection. What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you. The older ones remembered when she'd arrived at Briar Hollow as a girl, already marked by something different, already touched by what they called the knowing. "She talks to things that ain't there," said Thomas, the blacksmith, his voice low as he worked the bellows one humid afternoon. "Seen her down by the bayou last week, speaking to the water like it was answering back." "My mama said her mama was from across the water," added Grace, a field hand who'd lost 2 fingers to infection. "Said she came with marks on her skin that wasn't from no whip, marks she was born with." They spoke of Martha with respect edged with fear, the way one speaks of a storm cloud on the horizon, acknowledging its power while hoping it passes by. She had buried 4 children, each one taken by the plantation's endless appetite for suffering. She had outlived 3 masters, each death leaving her more isolated, more removed from the world of the living. And for the past 5 years, since old Master Varnham died and his son Silas inherited the estate, she had taken to spending her nights in a small shed behind the quarters, where candlelight flickered until dawn and strange smells drifted through the cracks in the walls. Silas Varnham was 28 years old, educated in Charleston and convinced of his own superiority, with the fervor of a man who'd never been tested by real adversity. He had returned to Briar Hollow with new ideas about efficiency and profit margins, ideas that translated into longer hours in the fields, reduced rations, and punishments carried out with mechanical regularity. Where his father had been cruel through indifference, Silas was cruel with purpose, viewing every act of discipline as a necessary investment in productivity. He noticed Martha within his first week. It was impossible not to. She was the oldest slave on the property, moving with a deliberate slowness that seemed almost defiant. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, the way she looked at him without the downcast submission he expected. The way she seemed to be measuring him, cataloguing him, as if he were the one being evaluated. "That old woman," he said to Jacob Crane, his head overseer, as they surveyed the fields from horseback. "The bent one, with the grey head wrap. What's her use?" Crane spat tobacco juice into the mud. "Martha, she works the big house mostly, cleaning, tending to your mother when she's unwell. Too slow for field work now, but she knows herbs and such. The others go to her when they're sick. She practices medicine without training." "I wouldn't call it medicine exactly, sir. More like folk remedies. The slaves trust her." Silas's jaw tightened. "I won't have superstition undermining order. Watch her." But watching Martha proved difficult. She seemed to anticipate observation, always appearing engaged in acceptable tasks when supervisors were near. Yet somehow the whispers continued. Slaves would slip away at odd hours, returning with small bundles hidden in their clothing. Strange symbols appeared scratched into the dirt near the quarters, quickly erased, but recurring with stubborn persistence. And then there was the matter of the shed. It had been a tool storage building once, barely large enough to stand in, with a roof that leaked and walls that didn't quite meet the ground. Martha had claimed it years ago, and successive overseers had allowed it, viewing it as harmless eccentricity. But Silas, prowling the grounds one midnight when sleep eluded him, saw light emanating from its cracks and heard something that stopped him cold. Singing, low and rhythmic, in a language he didn't recognize. Not the spirituals the slaves sang in the fields, but something older, something that seemed to come from deep in the throat, almost growling. And beneath it, another sound, like wind moving through the building, though the night air was still. He approached silently, years of hunting making his footsteps soundless. Through a gap in the wall, he could see Martha kneeling before what appeared to be an altar of sorts. Bones arranged in careful patterns, feathers tied with thread. A bowl of something dark and liquid, candles made from what looked like animal fat, their flames burning with an odd greenish tint, and Martha herself, transformed. Her bent posture straightened, her voice strong and clear, her movements fluid and purposeful as she traced symbols in the air. For a moment, Silas could have sworn he saw something else in the shed with her. A shadow that moved independently of the candlelight, something tall and impossibly thin that bent over her like a listening parent. Then she turned her head, not toward the door, but toward the exact spot where Silas stood watching, and smiled. A smile that knew he was there, had always known, and welcomed his witnessing. In that moment, Silas Varnham felt something he'd never experienced before on his own property. Fear. Pure, instinctive, animal fear that sent him backing away from the shed and walking quickly toward the big house, his heart hammering against his ribs. The next morning, he summoned Jacob Crane before breakfast. "The old woman's shed. What's kept in there?" "Nothing I know of, sir. She sleeps there sometimes, I believe." "She practices witchcraft. I saw it myself last night. Bones and symbols and God knows what else." Crane shifted uncomfortably. "The slaves have their ways, Mr. Varnham. Always have. Long as it doesn't interfere with work." "It interferes with Christian order." Silas slammed his hand on the desk. "I won't have devil worship on my land. Have the shed cleared and burned. Bring me everything inside it first. I want to see what she's been doing." "Sir, that might cause trouble." The others looked to her. "Then let them see what happens to those who traffic with darkness. Do it today." By noon, 6 overseers had descended on Martha's shed. She stood nearby, silent and still, as they dragged out her possessions. The altar, crude but carefully constructed. Bundles of herbs, some recognizable, others not. Jars containing liquids and powders. Bones that might have been chicken, might have been something else. And at the very back, wrapped in cloth, a doll made from corn husks and human hair, its face painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The slaves gathered at a distance, watching. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable, electric, like the air before a lightning strike. Martha's face remained impassive as her belongings were piled in the yard. Only when Silas himself approached did her expression change, a slight tightening around the eyes, a deepening of something ancient and patient. "You are a Christian woman?" Silas asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I know the Lord," Martha replied, her voice rough with age but steady. "Then you know witchcraft is an abomination. What you've been doing in this shed is devil's work." "I've been praying, Master Varnham. Ain't no law against prayer." "Prayer?" He kicked at the pile of bones. "This is prayer. Different folk pray different ways. My mama taught me her ways, and her mama taught her. Ain't nothing evil in asking for protection, for healing, for mercy in this hard world." Silas's face flushed with anger. "You dare speak to me of hardship? I provide for you, feed you, clothe you. And this is how you repay Christian charity, with heathen practices that corrupt the others. Something flickered in Martha's eyes then. Something that might have been amusement, or might have been pity. Christian charity, she repeated softly, as if tasting the words. Yes, sir, that's surely what you provide. The quiet insolence in her tone was the final straw. 10 lashes, Silas ordered, and burn everything. Let this be a lesson to all who would choose darkness over the light of civilization. They tied Martha to the whipping post in the center of the yard, where all punishments were administered for maximum visibility. She made no sound as they bound her wrists, no plea for mercy as they tore the back of her dress to expose the landscape of old scars. The other slaves were forced to watch, as was custom, a reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Jacob Crane wielded the whip himself, each strike precise and measured. Martha's body jerked with impact, but from her lips came nothing, no scream, no whimper, only a low humming that grew stronger with each lash. By the 5th stroke, several slaves had begun to weep. By the 8th, even some of the overseers looked uncomfortable. And by the 10th, as blood ran down Martha's legs and pooled in the dirt, her humming had become words in that same strange language Silas had heard the night before. When they cut her down, she collapsed into the arms of 2 younger women who carried her away. Behind them, Silas personally set fire to the contents of her shed, the flames consuming herbs and bones and carefully preserved elements of a practice older than the plantation, older than the nation itself, older perhaps than Christianity itself in these lands. As the smoke rose into the afternoon sky, dark and oily, a strange thing happened. The birds that had been singing in the trees fell silent. The insects that perpetually buzzed in the Louisiana heat ceased their droning. Even the wind, which had been pushing the smoke westward, simply stopped, leaving the column of black rising straight up like a pillar connecting earth and heaven. Thomas, the blacksmith, felt his hammer slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. Grace, watching from the quarters, crossed herself and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her. And old Benjamin, who'd been born on this plantation 70 years ago and seen things no man should see, simply shook his head and said, "Lord, have mercy on us all." She done called something now. She done called something that's gonna answer. That night, Martha lay on a pallet in the quarters, her back a ruin of torn flesh that the other women treated with what herbs they could gather. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking clearly, sometimes in that other language, sometimes in tongues no one recognized. Fever took her by midnight, her body burning hot enough that the women feared she wouldn't see dawn. But at some point in those dark hours between midnight and morning, Martha's eyes opened, fully awake, fully aware, and filled with a purpose that made the women attending her step back. She sat up despite the agony it must have caused, despite the fresh blood that began flowing from reopened wounds, and spoke in a voice that didn't seem entirely her own. "I need to go to the fields, the cane fields. I need to go now." "Martha, you can't." Sarah, one of the younger women, tried to stop her. "I have to finish what I started, before it's too late, before the door closes." Martha's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping Sarah's wrist. "You don't understand. I called to them years ago when they took my last baby. Called and called, but I wasn't ready, didn't have the right words, the right offerings. But I kept trying, kept learning. And tonight, after what he done, after he burned what I spent 5 years building, tonight they're listening. Tonight the door is open." "Who's listening, Martha? Who did you call?" But Martha was already standing, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders, moving toward the door with a determination that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. The women looked at each other, uncertain, afraid. Finally, Thomas appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. "Let her go," he said quietly. "Ain't our place to stop what's been set in motion. Whatever she's doing, it's for all of us. For everyone who came before, and everyone who'll come after." Martha nodded at him, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude, then stepped out into the night. The moon was nearly full, painting the plantation in silver and shadow. She walked slowly but steadily toward the cane fields, leaving a trail of blood drops that looked black in the moonlight. The cane stood 8 feet tall, the stalks rustling despite the continued absence of wind. Martha pushed through them, letting them cut her arms and face, adding fresh blood to what already flowed from her back. She walked until she reached a small clearing deep in the field, a space where nothing grew, where the earth itself seemed darker than the surrounding soil. Here she knelt. The pain was extraordinary, transcendent, almost ecstatic. She dug her fingers into the earth, feeling it cool and damp beneath the surface, and began to draw. Symbols that had been passed down through generations, symbols that predated the Middle Passage, symbols that belonged to a time when her people had their own lands, their own gods, their own power. She drew with blood and mud, creating a circle, then patterns within the circle, a map of sorts, a doorway, an invitation, and as she worked, she spoke. Not the prayers of the Christian God that had been forced upon her, but the old prayers, the real prayers, the ones that called to things that existed before missionaries and masters and the chains that bound her people. "Hear me," she whispered. Then louder, "Hear me. I am Martha, daughter of Ayaba, granddaughter of Ife, blood of the old blood. I call to you who existed before the white man's God, you who remember the true names, you who hold the scales of justice that never tip toward mercy." Sotato. The air grew cold, impossibly, absurdly cold for a Louisiana summer night. Martha's breath became visible, and frost began to form on the cane stalks around her. The blood she'd used to draw her symbols began to steam, vapor rising and taking shapes that almost looked deliberate, almost looked like figures gathering to witness. They took my children, all 4, worked them to death, beat them to death, let them die of fevers while they tended to white babies who weren't their own. They took my body, used it, broke it, scarred it until I don't even recognize myself in still water. They took my name, gave me a new one, like I was a dog to be called whatever suited their tongues. Her voice rose, powerful despite her injuries, despite her age. But they couldn't take what I am, couldn't take what my mama gave me, what her mama gave her. They burned my altar, but the power don't live in bones and herbs. It lives in blood, in suffering. In rage that's been passed down so long, it's become something more than human emotion. It's become a force, and tonight I offer it to you. I offer you all my pain, all my years, all my death that's coming soon anyway. Take it, and give me what I ask. Give me justice, give me revenge, give me one night where they feel what we've felt, where they know fear like we've known fear. Lightning split the sky, though no storm clouds were visible. The crack of thunder was so loud it shook the ground, sent ripples through the muddy water between the cane rows, and in the silence that followed, something answered. Not with words, not with sound, but with presence. Martha felt it descending, filling the clearing, filling her, something vast and ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for a call strong enough, a pain deep enough, a sacrifice worthy enough to give it entry into this world. Her body convulsed, back arching despite the destroyed flesh, mouth opening in a scream that never came because something else was pouring in, filling her throat, her lungs, her very soul. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites that began to darken, turning black as ink, as the void, as the spaces between stars where light never reached. And then, as suddenly as it began, she collapsed, falling forward into the mud, into the symbols she'd drawn, her body still and silent. For a moment nothing moved. Even the cane stopped rustling. The world held its breath. Then Martha's eyes opened, but they weren't Martha's eyes anymore. They were windows into something else, something that wore her body like an ill-fitting coat and looked out at the plantation with interest and hunger and a kind of terrible joy. In the big house, Silas Varnham woke from a nightmare he couldn't remember, his nightshirt soaked with sweat, despite the strange chill that had crept into his bedroom. His wife, Caroline, slept beside him, their newborn son in a cradle near the window. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, safe. But as Silas rose to check the window to see if a storm was approaching, he noticed something odd. The glass was fogged, as if someone had been breathing on it from outside. And in that fog, something had been drawn, a symbol he didn't recognize, intricate and disturbing, that seemed to move and shift as he stared at it. He reached out to wipe it away, and his hand passed through the fog without disturbing it. The symbol remained, and now he could see more appearing on other surfaces. The mirror above his wash basin, the window in the hallway, even the glass covering a portrait of his father. All fogging simultaneously, all bearing variations of the same impossible symbol. From downstairs came a sound, a slow, dragging footstep, then another. Something was in his house, moving with patient deliberation toward the stairs. Silas grabbed the pistol he kept in his nightstand, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He moved to the bedroom door, pressing his ear against it. The footsteps continued, reaching the base of the stairs now, beginning to ascend. Step, drag, step, drag. Like someone climbing with great difficulty, or something unfamiliar with how human legs worked. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound commanding, but hearing the tremor in his own voice. "I'm armed!" The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched for 5 heartbeats, 10, 15. Then from directly outside his door, impossibly close though he'd heard nothing cross the final distance, came a voice. Martha's voice, but wrong. Layered with something else, something that sounded like multiple throats speaking in unison, like an echo from somewhere deep and hollow. "Master Varnham," it said, and somehow he could hear the smile in it. "You wanted to see real power. You wanted to know what I was calling to in my shed. Now you'll see, now you'll know, and now you'll pay." The door began to rattle in its frame, not as if something was pushing it, but as if it was trying to escape the wall itself, as if the wood remembered being a living tree and wanted desperately to run. Silas fired through the door. 3 shots, the sound deafening in the enclosed hallway, wood splintering outward. Caroline screamed awake, clutching the sheets, and the baby began wailing in his cradle. Silas's hands shook as he reloaded, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the room. For a moment, there was only the sound of the infant crying and his wife's terrified breathing. Then came a low, wet chuckle from the other side of the door. Not pained, not frightened, amused. "Iron and lead," the voice said. "You think those things touch what I am? You think your little weapons mean anything to something that existed before weapons, before iron, before your kind crawled out of caves?" The door swung open, slowly, deliberately, and there stood Martha. Or what had been Martha. Her body was upright despite the ruined back, despite the blood loss that should have killed her. Her head tilted at an angle no living neck should achieve, and her eyes, God, her eyes were completely black, reflecting nothing, absorbing light like holes in the world. The bullet wounds in the door were visible, but nothing marked her body. The shots had passed through empty air. "You see it now, don't you?" the thing wearing Martha said, taking a step into the room. Behind it, the hallway had changed. The walls appeared to stretch backward impossibly far, and shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't, climbing the walls like living things, reaching toward the bedroom. "You see that what you burned this afternoon wasn't the power. It was just the wrapper. Pretty words and bones and herbs to make simple people feel like they had control. But the real power, that was always in the blood, in the suffering, in the rage of people you thought you owned." Silas backed toward the window, putting himself between this thing and his family. "You're not Martha. What are you?" "Oh, I'm Martha. Every bit of her that matters is still here. Her memories, her pain, her very justified desire to watch you suffer. But I'm also more. I'm every god your people tried to bury, every spirit your priests said didn't exist, every bit of power you tried to pray away and legislate into nothing." It smiled, and its teeth seemed too numerous, too sharp. I'm what happens when you hurt something old enough to remember how to hurt back. Caroline had pulled the baby from his cradle and was pressed against the wall, trying to make herself small, invisible. The infant's cries had changed character, becoming a high-pitched keening that spoke to some primal awareness of wrongness, of predatory attention. "What do you want?" Silas asked, though part of him already knew. "Want?" The thing laughed, and the sound contained multitudes. Martha's wheeze, but also the scream of wind through dead trees, the crack of whips, the rattle of chains, the last gasps of children dying in fields. "I want what Martha wanted, what every soul suffering under your whips wants. Justice, vengeance, an evening of accounts that's centuries overdue." It moved closer, and Silas could smell it now. Not the expected odor of an elderly slave woman, but something else. Bayou mud and old blood and ozone from lightning strikes, and something underneath it all that smelled like rage, crystallized into physical form. "But first," it said, turning its attention to the cradle, to Caroline, to the screaming infant, "I want you to understand loss. Real loss, the kind Martha felt 4 times, the kind your kind has inflicted on mine for generations." "No!" Silas lunged forward, but the thing moved faster than anything should move. One moment it was by the door, the next it was beside Caroline, one impossible hand reaching toward the baby with fingers that seemed to elongate as they moved. But before it could touch the child, a new sound erupted from downstairs, shouting, running feet, Jacob Crane's voice bellowing orders. The overseers had heard the shots and were coming. The thing paused, tilting its head, listening. Then it smiled again, wider this time. "Ah, more guests. How thoughtful. This will go faster with everyone assembled." It turned and walked out of the room, moving down the stairs with that same dragging gait, step drag, but faster now, eager. Silas grabbed his wife and child, pulling them toward the other door that led to the rear stairs. "Go. Take the baby and go. Get to the quarters. Wake everyone. Get them running. This whole place is cursed now." "What about you?" Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. "I'll try to stop it. I'll try to—" No. But he had no idea how to finish that sentence. How did you stop something that bullets passed through? Something that wore a dead woman's body like a puppet? Downstairs, the screaming started. Jacob Crane's voice first, bellowing in terror rather than command, then cutting off abruptly. Other voices followed, the 2 overseers who'd come with him, their shouts of alarm turning to shrieks of agony and then to nothing. Silas descended the main stairs, pistol useless in his hand, but gripped anyway, because it was the only thing he had. The foyer was a nightmare. Jacob Crane lay crumpled against the far wall, his body bent in ways that suggested every bone had been broken simultaneously. The 2 overseers were worse. One appeared to have been turned inside out, his interior now decorating the exterior in a grotesque inversion of anatomy. The other was still technically alive, choking on his own blood, his eyes pleading for death as something invisible continued to methodically break pieces of him. And in the center of it all stood Martha, her arms spread wide, her black eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Around her, the shadows had taken on solidity, writhing like tentacles, lashing out at anything living with methodical precision. "Stop this!" Silas heard himself say, knowing how pathetic it sounded. "Please! Kill me if you want, punish me, but leave the others alone." Martha's head swiveled toward him with an owl's precision. "The others? You mean your wife? Your child? The way you left Martha's children alone? The way you showed mercy to every mother who watched her babies die because healing them would cost more than replacing them?" "I never," but he had. God help him, he'd made exactly those calculations, those cold economic decisions that made children's lives worth less than the effort to save them. "No more lies," Martha said. "No more justifications. Tonight, the bill comes due, not just for you, for this house, this plantation, this entire corrupt structure built on our backs." She raised her hands, and the shadows surged upward, flowing across the ceiling, down the walls, beginning to cover every surface with writhing darkness. The temperature dropped further, cold enough that Silas's breath came in white clouds, cold enough that ice began forming on the windows and floors. Outside, he could hear more commotion, the slaves emerging from the quarters, drawn by the noise. He wanted to warn them, to tell them to run, but his voice had abandoned him. All he could do was watch as Martha's vengeance manifested in physical form, as something ancient and terrible took its first free breaths in this world in centuries. The shadows reached the stairs. They began climbing toward where Caroline and the baby were hiding. And Silas realized with absolute certainty that nothing he could do would stop what was coming. The entity Martha had summoned wasn't just here to kill him, it was here to end everything. From outside came a new sound, singing. The slaves had begun to sing, their voices rising in one of the old spirituals, but changed somehow. The melody altered into something that predated Christianity, that reached back to African shores and older gods. The sound of it seemed to make the shadows pause, to make Martha's borrowed body shudder. "They're singing for you," Silas said, seeing a possibility. "Your people. Whatever you are, you serve them, don't you? You're their vengeance, their justice." Would they want this? Would they want their children to witness more horror? Martha laughed, but there was something uncertain in it now. The singing was growing louder, more slaves joining in, and the words, though he couldn't understand them, carried power. Old power. Different from what animated Martha, but related, part of the same ancient web of belief and ritual that white colonizers had tried to destroy but had only driven underground. "You think their songs protect you?" Martha hissed. "You think faith in some gentler spirits will stop what I've become?" "I think you're still Martha," Silas said, desperately grasping for anything. "I think part of her is still in there, and she wouldn't want her people to see this, to be traumatized by this, to carry this memory." For a moment, just a moment, the blackness in Martha's eyes flickered. Something human looked through, something ancient and tired, and so very sad. "I am Martha," she whispered, and her voice was only her own. "And I want them to see, I want them to know we're not powerless, that there are forces that remember us, that answer us, that can make the masters pay." The shadows surged forward again, but slower now, fighting against the growing power of the voices outside. More slaves had joined the singing, and now Thomas's deep bass carried another layer, words in a language only he and a few of the eldest remembered. A language from before the ships, before the chains, before everything broke. Martha's body jerked, pulled in two directions. The entity using her wanted violence, wanted blood, wanted the complete destruction it had been summoned to deliver. But Martha herself, the woman who'd spent 53 years surviving, who'd learned to live in the cracks between obedience and resistance, who'd helped birth babies and buried children and taught the young ones which herbs could heal and which could kill, that Martha hesitated. "They need hope," came a new voice. Old Benjamin stood in the doorway, bent double with age, but eyes bright with understanding. "Not more trauma, not more reason to fear. They need to know the spirits can protect, not just destroy. They need to know we can fight back," Martha the entity snarled. "We do fight," Benjamin said quietly. "Every day we don't die is fighting. Every song we sing in secret is fighting. Every child we raise to know their worth, despite what the masters say, is fighting. You want to give them revenge, give them this man's fear, give them his respect, give them the knowledge that we have power, but don't give them nightmares. Don't make them afraid of their own spiritual heritage." The thing in Martha screamed. A sound that shattered every mirror in the house, that sent cracks spider-webbing through the walls. But it was losing, the human heart in the center of it all reasserting control. the singing outside, providing an anchor to something better than pure destruction. Martha's body collapsed, folding in on itself like a puppet with cut strings. The shadows retreated, pulling back into corners and cracks, not gone but contained. The terrible cold receded slightly, and when she looked up again, her eyes, while still dark, held something more complex than simple malevolence. "I could kill you," she said to Silas, and he knew it was true. "I could tear this house down and everyone in it. The thing I called would do it gladly. But my people are singing. They're reminding me why I survived so long. Not for revenge, for them. To protect them." She stood, and Silas saw the full horror of her condition, the torn back still bleeding, the impossible angle of her neck, the way her body moved, despite injuries that should be fatal. She was dying, had perhaps been dead since she collapsed in the cane field, kept animate only by the entity's power and her own stubborn will. "But hear this, Silas Varnham," she said, stepping close enough that he could see himself reflected in those dark eyes. "What I called doesn't sleep. What I invited in doesn't leave. It's in this house now, in these walls, in the earth itself. Every child born here will feel it. Every master who tries to raise a whip will know fear in the night. This place is marked now, haunted, not by me, I'll be dead soon enough, but by what I brought through." She swayed, her strength finally failing. Thomas and 2 other men entered cautiously, catching her as she fell. "Get her back to the quarters," Thomas said. "Whatever time she has left, let her spend it with her people." They carried her out, and as they did, Martha's voice, weak now but still carrying, said one last thing. "The baby, in the cradle. I touched him before you stopped me. Didn't hurt him. But he'll see things now, things beyond the veil. Let that be my gift and my curse, a master's son who'll know the truth about what lies beneath the world you think you control." Then she was gone, carried into the night, surrounded by the still singing slaves. Silas stood in his ruined foyer, surrounded by the dead, and knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. Whatever Martha had done, whatever she'd summoned, it wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. Upstairs, Caroline's scream confirmed his fears. He ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time, bursting into the bedroom to find her holding the baby, staring in horror at his face. The infant's eyes were open, but where blue irises should be, there was only white. Blind white, unseeing white, the white of eyes that had looked at something they shouldn't have and been burned clean by the vision. "What did she do?" Caroline sobbed. "What did that witch do to our son?" Silas had no answer. He could only hold his wife and blind child while below, in his foyer, blood slowly pooled and shadows that shouldn't exist waited patiently for night to fall again. Martha died 3 days later, surrounded by the people she'd protected and served and loved despite everything. Her passing was quiet, a final breath that barely disturbed the air, so different from the violence she'd summoned that it seemed almost anticlimactic. They buried her in the small cemetery behind the quarters, a place where slaves had been interred for 3 generations, marked only by wooden crosses and stones that would weather away until the dead beneath were forgotten. But Martha's grave was different from the day it was dug. Plants refused to grow on it. Rain would fall everywhere except the small rectangle of earth covering her body. And at night, those brave or foolish enough to pass near it swore they could hear singing, that same old song she'd used in her shed, continuing eternally beneath the ground. The plantation tried to continue as normal. Silas ordered the dead overseers buried, had the foyer cleaned and repainted, brought in a priest from New Orleans to bless the house. Father Michaud was an elderly Jesuit with experience in what he carefully called spiritual disturbances. He spent 2 days examining the property, speaking with slaves who'd witnessed the events, studying the symbols Martha had drawn in the cane fields. On the 3rd day, he met with Silas in the study, his face grave. "I cannot help you," he said simply. "What do you mean? You're a priest. You perform exorcisms, don't you?" "I do, I have. But this..." Father Michaud gestured vaguely at the house around them. This is not a demon in the Christian sense. It's not something that fears the cross or holy water. That woman called to something older than Christ, older than Rome, older than Jerusalem. She reached back to powers that existed when my faith was still local folk religion in Palestine. I have no authority over such things. Then what am I supposed to do? The priest stood, gathering his things. Leave, abandon this place. The slaves told me the entity made a bargain of sorts. It wanted total destruction, but the woman's humanity held it back. It's contained for now, bound by her last wishes. But it's still here, still watching, still waiting for the right moment or the right provocation. Every act of cruelty feeds it. Every scream of a whipped slave strengthens it. This plantation is no longer simply cursed, Mr. Varnham. It's become a doorway, and doorways work both ways. After the priest left, Silas stood at his study window, watching the fields where slaves worked in the oppressive heat. They moved slower than before, more fearful. Production had dropped nearly 30% since Martha's death. But more concerning was the change in their demeanor. They no longer avoided his eyes. They looked at him directly now, with something that wasn't quite defiance, but wasn't submission either. They looked at him the way one looks at a condemned man, with a mixture of pity and anticipation. Caroline rarely left her room now. The baby, whom they'd named Nathaniel, required constant care. His blindness wasn't the only issue. He cried endlessly, not the normal crying of infants, but screaming that suggested terror or pain beyond what such a young mind should process. Doctors came from New Orleans and Baton Rouge, examined him, and found nothing physically wrong with his eyes. The structures were intact. By all accounts, he should see normally. It's as if something has severed the connection between eye and mind, one doctor explained, or perhaps his mind simply refuses to process what the eyes show it. I've read of such cases in soldiers who've witnessed extreme horrors, but in an infant, I have no explanation. And there were other problems. Objects in the nursery would move on their own, rattles appearing on the other side of the room, blankets folding themselves, the cradle rocking when no one was near it. The wet nurse they'd hired quit after a week, swearing she'd seen a shadow standing over the cradle in the shape of an old woman, watching the child, with eyes that held stars. On the 7th night after Martha's death, the entity made its first true appearance since that initial evening. Silas woke to find his room freezing again, his breath misting in the air despite it being July. The window was fogged, but this time, instead of symbols, words were written. The bargain holds, but bargains can be broken. He sat up slowly, reaching for the lamp, but before he could light it, he saw something that stopped his heart. In the corner of the room, visible only as a deeper darkness against the night, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, its head brushing the 12-foot ceiling. Thin to the point of being skeletal, and from where eyes should be, 2 points of light that weren't quite light, more like the absence of darkness, an unblackness that hurt to look at. "Martha is gone," it said, and the voice was nothing like the layered sound from before. This was singular, ancient, vast as the gulf between stars. Her mercy no longer restrains me. Her humanity no longer tempers my purpose. Silas couldn't move, couldn't speak. Every muscle had locked, his body recognizing something fundamental. This was a predator, and he was prey. This was death, if not in body, then in every way that mattered. "But I am bound by my word," the entity continued. "I promised her I would not simply destroy, that I would give her people hope rather than trauma. So I remain contained, watching, waiting. But know this, Silas Varnham, I am patient. Immortal things always are. I can wait for you to break the bargain. I can wait for your son to grow old. I can wait for your son's son. And the moment, the very instant, that anyone in your bloodline raises a hand in cruelty to one of Martha's people, I am free. The bargain ends, and what I do then will make that first night look like mercy. What do you want from me? Silas managed to whisper. Change, growth, justice. The things Martha wanted but couldn't achieve in life. Free your slaves, pay them wages, treat them as humans, or don't. Keep them in chains, work them until they break, continue as you have. But know that every whip crack, every scream, every death from overwork or medical neglect, all of it feeds me, strengthens me, brings closer the day when I can fulfill my original purpose. The entity moved closer, and Silas could see now that it wasn't truly in his room. It was somehow behind reality, pressing against the membrane of the world, like a hand pushing through wet paper, distorting but not quite breaking through. Your son sees me, it said. His eyes show him the truth of things. He sees me always, everywhere, watching from between the cracks in reality. That is my gift to him. That is why he screams. He knows what waits, what watches, what will eventually, inevitably be unleashed. Then it was gone, simply ceasing to exist in that space, leaving Silas alone in the dark, with only the sound of his own ragged breathing and, from down the hall, his son's renewed screaming. The next morning, Silas gathered all the overseers and announced a new policy. No more physical punishment without his direct approval. No more whipping for minor infractions. Better rations, access to medical care, permission for slaves to maintain their cultural practices and religious ceremonies. The overseers stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Sir, you can't be serious," Jacob Crane's replacement, a hard man named Morrison, said. "You give them an inch, they'll take a mile. This is what comes from letting that witch put fear in you." "This is what comes from understanding the cost of cruelty," Silas replied. "Implement these changes immediately. Anyone who refuses can find employment elsewhere." Half the overseers quit within a week. Production continued to fall. Other plantation owners in the region began to whisper that Silas Varnham had gone soft, had lost his nerve, had been bewitched by that old slave woman. Some even suggested he'd been replaced by an imposter, that the real Silas had died that night, and something else now wore his face. But in the quarters, things changed. Thomas the blacksmith found himself treated with respect, asked his opinion on work schedules and tool maintenance. Grace, who'd lost her fingers, was moved to the kitchen where she could work without fieldwork's physical demands. Children weren't separated from mothers as readily. Food improved, not to luxury but to adequacy. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the oppressive weight that had hung over Briar Hollow since that night began to lift. Not entirely. It could never be entirely gone. The entity had made that clear. But it lessened. The shadows in corners seemed less predatory. The cold spots that had appeared throughout the house grew less frequent. Objects stopped moving on their own. Little Nathaniel's screaming reduced to normal infant crying. He was still blind, would always be blind, but the terror seemed to ease. His nursemaid, an older slave woman named Ruth, claimed she could sometimes see him tracking things with his blank eyes, as if watching something move through the room. But whatever he saw no longer terrified him. Perhaps he was growing used to it. Or perhaps the entity, seeing Silas's attempts to change, had eased its presence. Thomas, visiting the big house to repair a door hinge, found himself alone with Silas for a moment. "What you're doing," he said carefully, "changing how things are run. The people appreciate it, but they also wonder, is it real? Or are you just afraid?" Silas could have been offended, should have been offended, but he found himself answering honestly. "Both. I'm terrified. Every night I expect that thing to appear and tell me I've broken some rule I didn't know existed. But it's also real. I see now what I didn't let myself see before. This system, it's monstrous. What we do to you, what we've done for generations, it creates monsters on both sides. Martha knew that. That thing she called knew that. She called to the Orisha," Thomas said quietly. "Old gods from before the ships. My grandfather knew their names. Most of us forgot, but Martha remembered. She reached back through all the years, all the pain, and found something that still listened, that still cared what happened to us. Is it a god, that thing? It's something. Maybe a god, maybe a devil, maybe something else that doesn't fit in either box. But it's real, and it's tied to this place now. Every future generation will feel it. Your sons' children, their children, all the way down. Briar Hollow belongs to it now, belongs to Martha's memory. This plantation will never be clean. Silas knew it was true. He'd felt it every night, that presence watching from somewhere just beyond sight. Felt it judging every decision, weighing every action. The entity was patient because it knew it had time, knew that eventually someone in his bloodline would make a mistake, would let cruelty slip back in. And when that happened, "Tell me," Silas said, "if I freed everyone, if I abandoned the plantation entirely, would it leave?" Thomas considered this. "No. It's not here for you specifically. It's here for justice, for every plantation, for the whole cursed system. You're just where it manifested, where Martha was strong enough and desperate enough to open the door. But now that it's here, it won't leave until its work is done, until the last chain is broken and the last master learns what it means to be on the other end of power. Then we're all doomed, maybe. Or maybe that's the point. Maybe we were doomed the moment the first slave ship arrived. Maybe what Martha called isn't here to save anyone. It's here to witness, to remember, to make sure that when judgment comes, and it will come one way or another, there's something that remembers every crime, every cruelty, every death, something that can testify. That night, Silas stood in what had been Martha's shed. He'd had it rebuilt, exactly as it was, and filled with the items they'd burned. He'd found replacements for the herbs, gathered bones from chickens, even attempted to recreate the altar based on descriptions from slaves who'd seen it. It felt foolish, playing at rituals he didn't understand. But he needed to try something. "Martha," he said to the empty air, "I don't know if you can hear me, don't know if any part of you remains or if you're truly gone. But if you're there, if any essence of who you were survives, I'm trying. I know it doesn't undo what I did. Doesn't bring back your children or give you back the years I stole, but I'm trying to be better, to make this place less of a hell." Silence. No response, no sign that anyone or anything heard him. Then, just as he was about to leave, a single candle on the makeshift altar lit itself. The flame burned steady and bright, then began to flicker in a pattern that almost seemed deliberate. Long, short, like code, like language. And in the window glass, fogged despite the warm night, words appeared in that same feminine handwriting. "The trying matters, but the trying isn't enough. The debt is too old, the wound too deep. Keep trying anyway." The candle blew out. The fog vanished. And Silas was alone again, with only his inadequate attempts at redemption and the certain knowledge that redemption in this case might not be possible. 6 months passed. Winter came to Louisiana, not the harsh freeze of northern states, but a wet, penetrating cold that seeped into bones and turned the plantation into a mud-choked quagmire. Production dropped further, partially due to Silas's reforms, partially due to weather, and partially due to something harder to quantify, a sense that the land itself had become less cooperative, as if the earth remembered what had been done upon it and was withdrawing its bounty in protest. Slaves who'd never experienced education were now learning to read in evening classes Silas had reluctantly permitted, taught by Caroline, who'd found purpose in the work after months of depression following Nathaniel's affliction. She started with the Bible, as was proper, but soon expanded to other texts, even some abolitionist writings she'd received from her sister in Philadelphia. "Do you understand what this could mean?" Silas had argued when he discovered the materials. "If other plantations find out I'm letting slaves read abolitionist literature, they already think you've lost your mind. Caroline replied, and there was something new in her voice. Strength, determination. Let them think it. Maybe you have. Maybe we all needed to lose our minds to see how insane this entire system is. She'd changed since Martha's death, since Nathaniel's blinding. The frivolous society woman, who'd cared mainly for fashion and gossip, had been burned away by horror and grief, leaving someone harder, clearer, more focused. She still mourned the son she'd expected, the heir who'd see normally and inherit without complication. But she'd also grown to love the son she had, the blind boy who reached toward things that weren't there and sometimes laughed at empty corners as if someone was playing with him. "He's not alone," she told Silas one evening as they watched Nathaniel, now 10 months old, playing on a blanket. "I know it sounds mad, but I don't think he's alone. Sometimes I see impressions, like the air thickening near him, like something visits but stays just hidden enough that I can't quite see it." "Martha," Silas said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Or the thing she called, or both. But whatever it is, it's not hostile, not to him. It's almost protective. She paused, watching as Nathaniel reached toward nothing, his face bright with infant joy. "I think Martha loved children, lost too many of her own. Maybe some part of her remains, watching over ours because she never could watch over hers." It was a comforting thought, though Silas suspected the truth was more complex. The entity had promised that Nathaniel would see things beyond the veil. Perhaps what the boy saw wasn't threatening because he was too innocent to interpret it as such. Children accepted strangeness more readily than adults. To Nathaniel, spirits and shadows were simply part of his world, no more frightening than dogs or horses. In the quarters, life had indeed improved materially. Food was adequate, punishment rare, medical attention more available, but the psychological weight remained. Freedom wasn't on offer, merely better slavery, and everyone knew the difference. Some found it enough. They'd never expected freedom anyway, so improved conditions felt like unexpected grace. Others chafed more than before because Silas's reforms proved that better was possible, which made the remaining injustices more glaring by contrast. Thomas the blacksmith became an informal leader, mediating between the slaves and Silas when issues arose. He carried himself differently now, straighter, more confident. The terror of Martha's night had transformed into something else, not quite pride, but a knowledge of hidden power, an awareness that they weren't as helpless as they'd been taught to believe. "The other's been asking," Thomas said one day, as he repaired a wagon wheel, "about freeing them. I know you got money troubles, know the plantation ain't producing like it used to, but freedom, that's what we really need." Silas had thought about it, obsessed over it during sleepless nights. But the practical realities were crushing. "If I free you all, how do you survive? Where do you go? I can't pay wages at scale that would support everyone, and freed blacks in Louisiana have almost no legal protection. You'd be vulnerable to slave catchers, to violence from other whites who'd see freed slaves as a threat to the whole system. So we're hostages to your protection, in a sense, yes." Silas hated saying it, hated how it sounded, but it was true. "The system is larger than this plantation, larger than me. I can't fix it alone." "Then work with others who want to fix it." That teacher Caroline corresponds with, the abolitionists up north. There's movements, organizations. "And what happens here while I'm trying to change laws and minds? What happens if other plantation owners decide I'm a traitor to my class and run us out? Who protects you then?" Thomas had no answer for that. Neither did Silas. They were trapped in a system that turned every attempt at morality into a complicated equation with no clear solutions. That night, the entity appeared in Silas's study. Not in full manifestation, it seemed to have learned to modulate its presence, to appear less overwhelmingly, but enough that Silas felt its attention like weight on his shoulders. "You're stalling," it said, voice quiet, but carrying absolute certainty. making improvements but avoiding the fundamental change. I'm trying to find a path that doesn't leave them worse off than before. No, you're trying to find a path that preserves your power, your property, your position. You're trying to be a good master, and there's no such thing. Master is the problem. The relationship is the problem. The ownership is the problem. So I should just free them, cast them out with nothing, no protection, no resources, into a world that will abuse them worse than I do. That's not the only option, and you know it. Deed them land, give them capital, create contracts that provide real partnership rather than ownership. There are models, other plantations that are experimenting, but you're afraid of losing control, afraid of what your peers will think, afraid of becoming truly equal to those you've owned. The accusation stung because it was partially true, but only partially. I'm also afraid of making things worse, of grand gestures that salve my conscience but actually increase suffering. Then ask them. Ask what they want. Stop deciding for them. That's what masters do. Decide for others. Assume they know best. Maintain control under the guise of protection. If you want to truly change, start by acknowledging you don't have the right to make their decisions. The entity faded, leaving Silas alone with the most subversive idea of all, that he should relinquish not just his cruelty, but his authority, his assumption of superiority, his fundamental belief that he knew better than the people he'd owned how their lives should be lived. The next day he called a meeting. Every slave who could be spared from essential work gathered in the barn, confused and apprehensive. Meetings called by the master were usually for announcements of new rules, new punishments, new demands. Instead, Silas said, "I want to know what you want, not what you think I want to hear, not what you think is safe to say. What do you actually want for your lives, your children, your futures?" Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. This was a trap, surely. Masters didn't ask such questions sincerely. This was a test to identify troublemakers. Finally, old Benjamin spoke. "Why are you asking this now?" "Because I've been trying to improve conditions, but operating on assumptions, making decisions for you. I was told recently that's still the behavior of a master, not a partner or ally. So I'm asking, what do you want?" More silence. Then Grace said quietly but clearly, "Freedom. That's what we all want. Freedom to go or stay as we choose. Freedom to earn wages for our work. Freedom to live without fear that we or our children will be sold away. That's what we want, what we've always wanted. You must know that." "And if I give you freedom," Silas asked, "what then? Where would you go?" Thomas spoke up. Some would leave, go north, try to find families sold away, start new lives. But many would stay if you offered fair terms. "We know this land, know how to work it. We could run this plantation better than you ever did, no offense intended. Could turn it into something real, something productive, if we had stake in the outcome instead of being forced." "You're proposing what? A cooperative?" "Don't know what fancy name you'd call it, but yes, let those who want to leave, leave. Those who stay become partners, own shares of production, work because it benefits them, not because they're forced. It's been done elsewhere in other countries. Ain't no reason it can't work here." The idea was radical, possibly illegal under Louisiana law, certainly social suicide among the planter class. But as Silas looked at the faces gathered before him, people he'd owned, exploited, treated as property, he saw something he'd never allowed himself to see before, not contentment or gratitude for improved conditions, but hunger, potential, the possibility of what they could become if given actual opportunity. "I need time," he said. "Time to consult lawyers, to understand the legalities, to structure something that might work, but I'm willing to try to fundamentally restructure things, to give up ownership in favor of partnership." He saw skepticism, hope, fear, calculation in their expressions. They didn't trust him, and why should they? Words were cheap. Only actions would matter. Over the following weeks, Silas worked with a lawyer from New Orleans who specialized in unusual contracts. The man was an abolitionist sympathizer, though cautious about it given the political climate. Together they crafted a framework. Any slave who wished to leave could do so, with a small amount of capital and safe passage to a free state arranged and paid for by Silas. Those who stayed would receive immediate manumission, but contract to work the plantation for a share of profits, with the land itself held in a trust that would gradually transfer ownership to the workers over 20 years. "You understand this makes you poor," the lawyer said. "You'll retain some ownership but lose most of your wealth, your social standing. You'll be ostracized by other planters. There's a real risk of violence against you and the freed slaves." "I understand. May I ask why?" "Guilt, fear, that haunting everyone whispers about." "All of those," Silas admitted, "but also because it's right. Because I've seen what evil looks like, truly seen it, and I've seen what my evil has summoned. If there's any chance of balancing those scales, of making the entity watching me decide mercy is appropriate, I have to try." The lawyer studied him. "You really believe something supernatural is involved?" "I know it is. It appears in my house. It speaks to me. It watches my son. And it's waiting for me to fail, to slip back into cruelty or selfishness. I can feel it always there, just behind reality, keeping score." "Then you're doing this to save yourself?" "I'm doing it because it's right and to save myself. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." The papers were drawn. On a cold morning in February 1840, Silas gathered everyone again and explained the offer. Freedom for all, immediately. Capital and passage for those who wished to leave. Partnership for those who stayed. The reaction wasn't the celebration he'd half expected. Instead, there was caution, discussion, debate. 20 people chose to leave immediately, mostly younger ones with no family ties to the area. The rest, around 50 adults, voted to stay and try the cooperative arrangement. They didn't trust Silas completely, but they knew the land, the work, and each other. This was the devil they knew, improved significantly. Thomas became the de facto leader of the worker council. Decisions about planting, harvest timing, resource allocation were now made collectively. Silas retained some authority as largest shareholder and resident expert on sales and negotiation, but he was no longer master. He was a partner, and an increasingly junior one. The transformation wasn't smooth. Decades of slavery had left wounds too deep for legal documents to heal. Trust had to be earned gradually through consistent action. Some of the freed workers struggled with the responsibility of self-direction after lifetimes of being told what to do. Others threw themselves into the work with energy Silas had never seen before. The difference between forced and voluntary labor manifested in everything from crop yields to maintenance quality, and through it all, the entity watched. Silas felt its presence less oppressively now, as if it approved of the direction, if not the pace. The cold spots in the house faded. Objects stopped moving on their own. Little Nathaniel seemed calmer, his mysterious playmate less agitated, but it wasn't gone. It couldn't be gone, not really. What Martha had summoned was permanent, a guardian or witness or both that would remain as long as the memory of suffering remained. On certain nights, especially anniversaries of Martha's death, Silas would wake to find words written in fog on his window. Better, but not forgiven, never forgiven, only witnessed. And he would nod to the empty room, acknowledging the truth. What had been done couldn't be undone. All that remained was to live as well as possible within the shadow of that guilt, making what amends were possible while knowing they would never be sufficient. By autumn of 1840, Briar Hollow had become something unprecedented in Louisiana, a plantation run by its former slaves, with the former master reduced to advisor and minority shareholder. Production remained lower than the old days of forced labor, but profitability was actually higher. Workers who had reason to care about outcomes worked smarter, if not harder, maintained equipment better, wasted less, but the social consequences were severe. Neighboring plantation owners refused to do business with Silas. His wife's family back east sent letters ranging from concern to condemning. Local churches suggested he not attend services, as his presence disturbed the social order. Even in New Orleans, 70 miles away, his name had become synonymous with radical foolishness at best, treason to his race and class at worst. The isolation might have broken him if not for a few factors. Caroline had fully embraced the changes, finding purpose in teaching and in observing how freed people built lives of dignity. Nathaniel, now 2 years old, was thriving despite his blindness, developing other senses with remarkable acuity and maintaining his mysterious connection to whatever existed beyond normal perception. And crucially, the entity had become almost companionable in its presence, less threatening judge and more, guardian, witness. Something that acknowledged effort even if it couldn't offer forgiveness. Thomas had fully grown into leadership, his natural intelligence and charisma finally given space to flourish. Under his guidance, the cooperative established systems that maximized fairness while maintaining productivity. They voted on major decisions, rotated less desirable tasks, ensured that parents had time with children and elders were cared for with dignity. "We're building something new," Thomas said one evening, as he and Silas reviewed the books. "Not perfect. Still got people who struggle, still got conflicts and difficulties, but it's ours, our choices, our consequences, our successes. That means everything." "I'm glad," Silas said, and found he meant it. The loss of absolute power had been terrifying initially, but there was relief in it too. Responsibility shared was lighter than responsibility hoarded. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Giving up your wealth, your position, all of it?" Silas considered carefully. "I regret waiting so long. I regret that it took Martha dying and calling up something terrifying to force my eyes open, but the changes themselves, no. I sleep better now than I did when I owned you all." "You never really owned us," Thomas said quietly. "That was always the lie. You owned our labor, our bodies maybe, but not us. Not really. What Martha proved is that we had power even then. Power to resist, power to endure, power to call down judgment on those who hurt us. The chains were real, but so was our humanity underneath them." That night, as Silas prepared for bed, he found a new message written in frost on his mirror, despite the warm temperature. "He understands. Finally. Took death and terror. But he understands. The debt remains. It always will. But the trying counts for something." The words melted as he watched, water running down the mirror like tears, and Silas felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched. Not forgiveness. The entity had been clear that forgiveness wasn't possible for what had been done. But acknowledgement. Recognition that change, however late and however imperfect, mattered. But peace was not to last long. In November, 3 men arrived from a neighboring plantation, ostensibly to see this experiment for themselves, but their expressions and bearing suggested other motives. Silas met them in the yard, with Thomas and several other workers nearby. "Varnham," the lead man, a wealthy planter named Beauchamp, sneered. "We've been patient with your lunacy, but it's gone too far. You've freed slaves who weren't yours to free, their property, investments, and you've effectively stolen from every plantation owner in Louisiana by suggesting they have rights." "They're free under law," Silas replied carefully. "I've filed all appropriate paperwork. Paperwork signed by radical judges and abolitionist lawyers. We don't recognize it. And we're here to reclaim what's rightfully ours, the example of proper order. You're going to re-enslave these people, restore discipline, or we'll do it for you." "No," Silas said simply. "Excuse me?" "I said no. This is my property. These are free people working under contract. You have no authority here." Beauchamp's face reddened. "We have the authority of civilization itself, the natural order that you're disrupting with your coddling and sentiment." "You think freeing a bunch of He didn't finish. Thomas had stepped forward, and though he said nothing, his presence, the presence of a blacksmith, powerful and now unafraid, made Beauchamp step back. "I think you should leave," Silas said. "Now." "This isn't over," Beauchamp snarled. "The legislature will fix this, or if not them, then justice of a more direct kind. You've made yourself and these people vulnerable. Don't say you weren't warned." They left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Caroline, watching from the house, felt cold dread. "They'll come back," she said when Silas returned inside. "They'll come with guns and chains and torch the place if they have to. The whole system is threatened by what we're doing." "Then we defend it," Silas said, though he had no idea how. "We've come too far to surrender now." That night he stood in what had been Martha's shed, now maintained as a small shrine by the workers who remembered her. "Martha," he said to the darkness, "if you're still listening, if any part of you remains, we need help. I've done what you wanted, changed things, but the system is fighting back. It won't let change happen peacefully." Silence at first. Then gradually the candles lit themselves. One by one, their flames growing brighter until the small space was illuminated like noon. And in that light, a shadow appeared, not threatening this time, almost maternal. "They will come," a voice said. Martha's voice, but stronger, clearer. "In 3 days, with 20 men, intent on making an example." "How can we stop them? We have maybe 12 guns, workers who've never been soldiers." "You don't stop them. I do." The shadow grew darker, more defined, and Silas saw it clearly for the first time. Not a monster, not exactly. Something complex. Martha herself merged with something older, something that was both protector and destroyer, justice and vengeance intertwined. "The bargain holds," it continued. "I cannot harm without cause, but if they come here with violence, with chains, intending to re-enslave those I protect, then they break the terms. Then they give me permission. You'll kill them. I will defend. The form that defense takes is not your concern." "Martha," Silas tried again, seeking the human beneath the divine. "Is this what you wanted? More death?" A pause. When the voice came again, it was softer, more recognizably the old woman's. "I wanted my people free. I wanted the masters to understand pain like we understood pain. I wanted justice. If justice requires death, well, the masters never hesitated to kill us when convenient. Why should different rules apply to them? Because then we become like them. No, that's the lie they tell to keep power. Fighting back isn't the same as oppressing. Defending isn't the same as attacking. They started this. We only finish it." Silas had no counter-argument. On a moral level, he knew Martha was right. Self-defense was justified, and what else was this but defending free people from re-enslavement? But he also knew the consequences. If Beauchamp and 20 men disappeared or died at Briar Hollow, it would bring down retribution far worse than what one entity, however powerful, could prevent. "There has to be another way," he said. "Something that stops them without starting a war we can't win." The shadow seemed to consider this. "Then what do you propose?" "Scare them, show them what waits here, make them understand that coming to Briar Hollow means facing something beyond their comprehension. Send them running so terrorized they never return, and warn others to stay away. Terror without death, if possible. Yes." Another pause. Then something that might have been a chuckle. "Martha always did prefer mercy when possible. Very well, I will demonstrate. Show them what protects this place. Give them nightmares instead of death. But know this, Silas Varnham. If they return despite the warning, if they persist, if anyone ever again tries to chain Martha's people, mercy ends. Understood?" "Understood." The candles blew out simultaneously. The shadow vanished. And Silas was left alone, hoping he'd made the right choice, fearing he'd simply delayed the inevitable violence. 3 days later, at dusk, they came. 23 men on horseback, armed with rifles and whips and chains. Beauchamp led them, confident and righteous. They'd come to restore order, to remind these uppity former slaves of their place, and to teach Varnham the cost of betraying his class. The workers had been warned. Women and children were hidden in the safest buildings. Men stood ready with what weapons they had, prepared to defend their freedom. Silas stood at the front, unarmed, knowing that violence from him would only justify what was coming. Beauchamp reined up his horse, looking down at Silas with contempt. "Last chance, Varnham. Restore order voluntarily, or we'll do it for you. These people are free. You have no authority here. We have all the authority we need." Beauchamp gestured, and his men began to dismount, preparing to advance. Then the temperature dropped, drastically, instantly. Breath became visible, horses began to panic, frost formed on the ground despite it being November in Louisiana, not nearly cold enough for such phenomena. "What the hell?" Beauchamp began. The shadows moved. Not naturally, not following light sources, but independently. They stretched across the ground toward the armed men, reaching like hands, like claws, like hungry things that had been waiting for permission to act. From the plantation house, from the slave quarters, from the fields themselves, shapes began to rise. Translucent, barely visible, but undeniably there. Figures that had once been slaves, now freed by death, if not by law, called forth by the entity to bear witness. Dozens of them, hundreds, every person who died at Briar Hollow over its 70 years of operation, summoned to stand between the living and those who'd come to re-enslave them. And above it all, towering over the main house, the entity itself manifested. 40 feet tall, if height meant anything for such beings. Impossibly thin, crowned with something that might have been light or might have been darkness too absolute to perceive. Its eyes, those terrible undark eyes, fixed on Beauchamp and his men. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere, from the ground and sky and the very air. "Leave. Now. Never return. This place is protected. These people are mine." Martha's people, those who suffered here, they belong to themselves now. Any who try to chain them again will join the dead in service, will become part of what I am, eternal witnesses to their own crimes. Several horses threw their riders and fled. The men who remained mounted struggled to control their terrified animals. One man fired his rifle at the entity, but the bullet passed through harmlessly, and the ghost shapes of the dead surged toward him specifically, reaching with translucent hands that somehow had weight, had touch, had ability to inflict something worse than pain. "Go!" the entity roared, and its voice shattered windows a quarter-mile away. "Go and tell all who will listen. Slavery ends here. The old order ends here. What comes next is unknown, but this particular evil will claim no more victims at Briar Hollow. I have marked this place. I have claimed these people, and I am patient, immortal, waiting." Beauchamp fled. His men followed, some dropping weapons in their haste, all screaming or praying or simply whimpering in terror. They rode as if hell itself pursued them, and in a sense it did, the shadows following for miles, the cold clinging to them, the ghost shapes visible in every reflection and shadow for days afterward. As suddenly as it had appeared, the entity withdrew. The temperature returned to normal, the ghost shapes faded, the supernatural display ended, leaving only stunned former slaves and a shaking former master standing in the gathering darkness. Thomas was the first to speak. That was necessary, Silas finished, merciful by the standards of what could have happened. But I don't think they'll be back. No, Thomas agreed. I don't think anyone will be back, not to bring chains anyway. He was right. Word spread through Louisiana and beyond about the haunting at Briar Hollow, about the supernatural forces protecting the freed slaves there. The story grew in the telling. Some versions had demons, others had African gods, still others suggested mass delusion or fever dreams, but the core remained consistent. Briar Hollow was cursed, protected, marked by something beyond human ability to control. Slave catchers refused to operate near the plantation. Other owners gave it wide berth. Even abolitionists and journalists who wanted to visit approached cautiously, unsure whether the stories were exaggerations, but unwilling to risk finding out. Briar Hollow became an island of freedom in a sea of slavery, maintained not by law or military force, but by supernatural reputation and genuine horror. And in the main house, Silas lived with the knowledge of what he'd unleashed, what Martha had called forth, what would never fully leave. On quiet nights, he could still feel it watching, still sense the presence of something vast and patient and utterly committed to its purpose. But he also slept better than he had in years, because for all its terror, for all the horror of what had happened, something good had come from it. People were free, children played without fear of being sold, families stayed intact, work was compensated, dignity was maintained. The price had been high. Martha's death, Nathaniel's blinding, Silas's wealth and position, the permanent haunting of the land itself. But looking at the faces of those who now worked as free people, who owned their labor and their futures, Silas couldn't quite bring himself to regret it. Some nights he stood at Martha's grave, which still refused to grow grass, and spoke to her. "I hope you're at peace," he'd say. "Or if not peace, then at least satisfied. You changed everything, Martha. Not just this place, but the possibility of what places like this could become, the proof that it can be different." The wind would sometimes answer, carrying words that might have been imagination, might have been memory, might have been something more. Peace comes later, when the last chain is broken, when the last master learns, when justice isn't just a promise but a reality. Until then, I watch, I wait. I protect what I can, and I remember, always remember. 5 years passed, and Briar Hollow transformed from experiment to functioning community. The cooperative grew more sophisticated, expanding into additional crops, establishing trade relationships with abolitionists in the north who were willing to pay premium prices for goods produced by free labor. Children attended the school Caroline had established, learning reading, arithmetic, and history that included their own heritage rather than erasing it. Nathaniel, now 7 years old, had become something unique in the South. A blind white child raised in a mixed community, playing with black children as equals, his supernatural sight making no distinction of race. The things he saw beyond the veil apparently didn't recognize human categories of division. To whatever spirits and entities inhabited his perception, people were simply people. Some bright, some dim, some carrying light, some carrying shadow, but the color of their skin utterly irrelevant to their spiritual essence. "I see her sometimes," Nathaniel told his mother one afternoon. "The old woman, the one everyone talks about." Caroline's breath caught. "Martha, you see Martha? She's made of light now, not like people light, but older, and there's something big behind her, something that watches everything. But she's in front of it, like a mother standing between her children, and something scary, keeping it calm, keeping it from being too angry. Is she at peace?" Nathaniel considered, his blank eyes turning toward something Caroline couldn't see. "She's not finished. She says she can't rest until it's all fixed. Not just here, everywhere. But she's less sad than she was, because we're better now, because her people are free here." This is the entity itself had grown less overtly present as years passed, though everyone felt it still watching. It manifested rarely now, only when threat approached or on anniversaries of significant events. But its mark remained on the land, in the way shadows fell slightly wrong, in how mirrors sometimes showed reflections that didn't quite match reality, in the persistent cold spot at the center of what had been the whipping yard. Thomas had aged well into his role as community leader. He'd married, had children, watched them grow up knowing only freedom. Sometimes he wondered what Martha would think of what they'd built, if she'd approve of the compromises they'd made, the practical decisions that balanced idealism with survival. "You ever regret staying?" Silas asked him one evening. They'd become something like friends, though the history between them, master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, meant the friendship was complex, marked by acknowledgement of past evil, even as they worked toward present good. "Sometimes I wonder what my life could have been if I'd left, gone north, started completely fresh. But then I look at what we've built here, how we've proven it's possible, and I think, maybe this is what I was supposed to do. Stay, fight. Build something new from the ruins of something terrible. Martha would be proud. Martha would say it's not enough," Thomas corrected. "She'd be right. One plantation being different doesn't fix the system, doesn't free the millions still in chains, doesn't undo centuries of wrong, but it's something. It's proof that different is possible." That night, as Silas conducted his usual evening tour of the property, a habit from his plantation management days that he'd never quite abandoned, he noticed something unusual. The door to Martha's shrine was open, candlelight visible inside. He approached cautiously, unsure who would be there at this hour. Inside, he found an elderly woman he didn't recognize, though her features suggested African heritage filtered through generations of mixture. She knelt before the altar, arranging new offerings, speaking quietly in a language that sounded like the one Martha had used in her rituals. "I'm sorry," Silas said. "I don't believe we've met. Are you visiting family here?" The woman turned, and her eyes, they were Martha's eyes. Not literally, not physically, but carrying the same depth, the same knowing, the same connection to things beyond normal perception. "I am Ayaba," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the candles flicker. "Martha's daughter, the first one, the one who died at age 6 from fever, while the master's wife's dog received medicine that might have saved her." Silas's blood went cold. You're one of the dead. One of the spirits. I am memory given form, one of many who Martha called that night. We remain because she remains, because the entity she summoned uses us to watch, to remember, to testify. And because on nights like this, the anniversary of her death, we can take form more fully, can speak more clearly. "What do you want?" Ayaba smiled, and it was Martha's sad smile. "To thank you for changing, for trying, however imperfectly, to fix what was broken. My mother spent 53 years in bondage, but she died knowing she'd started something, knowing her suffering wasn't meaningless, that it became the price paid to call forth protection for those who came after. I didn't do enough," Silas said, the familiar guilt rising. "I waited too long, changed too late. Your mother died because of my cruelty." "Yes," Ayaba agreed simply. "You carry that guilt, and you should, but you also carry the change that came after. Both things are true. You were terrible, and you became better. The terrible doesn't erase, but the better still matters." She stood, moving toward the door, her form already beginning to fade as the anniversary moment passed. "Tell my youngest brother, Thomas, that Mother watches him with pride. Tell him the dead remember not just the suffering, but also the resistance, the survival, the building that came after. We are not just witnesses to horror. We are witnesses to resilience too." Then she was gone, simply ceasing to exist between one moment and the next. Silas stood alone in the shrine, shaking, feeling the weight of the conversation settling into his bones. The next morning, he told Thomas what he'd seen, what Ayaba had said. Thomas wept, silently but deeply, tears for a sister he'd never met, for a mother whose loss had broken her enough to call down forces that shouldn't be called, but also tears of something like joy, that she was remembered, that her sacrifice meant something, that the dead kept watch and bore witness not just to pain, but to healing. "We need to make this official," Thomas said once he'd composed himself. "Document everything that's happened here. Write it down so future generations know what slavery was, what it cost, how it was finally broken in this place, and know what watches still, what waits to ensure it never returns." Together, they wrote the history of Briar Hollow. Silas from his perspective, Thomas from his, other community members adding their memories and insights. They documented Martha's life, her children who died, the events of that terrible night, the entity she'd summoned, the transformation that followed. They wrote honestly, sparing neither Silas's cruelty nor the horror of what Martha had done, presenting the full complexity of how evil could transform into something better through suffering, supernatural intervention, and the stubborn insistence on change. The document was sealed in 3 copies. One stayed at Briar Hollow, kept in the shrine. One was sent to abolitionists in Boston to be published as testimony. One was buried in Martha's grave, literally interred with the woman whose actions had started everything. Word of the document spread. Journalists came, carefully and cautiously, to interview survivors and document the haunted plantation. Some dismissed it as elaborate hoax or mass delusion. Others saw it as metaphor, slavery itself being the true horror, the supernatural elements just a way of expressing trauma. But some, particularly those who'd grown up in African traditions, who knew the old stories, the old powers, recognized truth in the account. Martha had indeed called something forth, something that predated Christianity, that remembered when people honored different gods, that had been diminished but never destroyed by colonization and forced conversion. She'd reached through her own blood and suffering to touch powers that still existed if you knew how to ask, how to offer, how to pay the necessary price. And that power remained at Briar Hollow, bound by Martha's dying wishes, but also by its own sense of purpose. It would protect this place, these people, their descendants. It would ensure that at least one location in the South stood as testimony that slavery could end, that systems could change, that the oppressed held power even when it seemed they had none. By 1850, Briar Hollow had become something approaching legendary. The Civil War was approaching, tensions rising between North and South, and this small plantation represented everything the debate was about. Proof that free labor could work. Proof that black people could manage their own affairs. Proof that supernatural forces, whether real or metaphorical, defended justice when humans failed to. Silas died in 1851, age 50, of a heart condition. His last words, spoken to Nathaniel, who sat beside his bed, were, "Tell Martha I tried. Tell her I'm sorry it wasn't enough, wasn't soon enough, but I tried." Nathaniel, 16 and still blind, but now able to navigate both the physical and spiritual worlds with eerie competence, simply nodded. "She knows, Father. She's here. She's always here. And she says you did enough, not to erase what was. Nothing erases that, but enough to matter, enough to count for something when the final tallies are made." Silas died with a small smile, the entity's presence heavy in the room, but no longer threatening, just witnessing, just recording this death as it had recorded all the others, adding it to the endless account it kept. Thomas led the community through the Civil War years, navigating the complexities of Louisiana's occupation, the formal end of slavery, the chaos of Reconstruction. Briar Hollow survived because it had already transformed, already proven that former slaves could manage land and prosper. They became a model, though an uncomfortable one that many white Southerners refused to acknowledge. Nathaniel grew into the role of keeper of the shrine, the one who communicated with the entity when it manifested, who mediated between the living community and the watching dead. His blindness was no longer a disability, but a gift, allowing him to see what others missed, to understand the layers of reality that overlapped at Briar Hollow. "Is it still there?" visitors would ask him. "The thing Martha called? The entity?" "Always," Nathaniel would reply. "It never leaves. It watches every child born here, every decision made, every moment when someone might slip back into old patterns of cruelty or ownership. It's the guardian and the judge, the witness and the enforcer, and it will remain as long as the memory of slavery remains, which means forever." Because some things can never be forgotten, should never be forgotten, even if they're forgiven. Are they forgiven? The masters? The cruelty? Nathaniel would shake his head slowly. Forgiveness isn't mine to grant or withhold. That's between individuals and their gods, their consciences, their victims. But the entity doesn't forgive. It only witnesses, remembers, ensures that the price of evil is paid, if not by the evildoers themselves, then by their descendants carrying that knowledge, that weight. In 1870, on the 30th anniversary of Martha's death, the community held a ceremony. Every person who'd been freed by Silas's actions attended. Children who'd grown up free, grandchildren who'd never known slavery, and the spirits visible that night to many people, not just Nathaniel, Martha's 4 children, countless others who died at Briar Hollow, and behind them all, the vast presence of the entity itself. Thomas, now 78 and frail, spoke, "We gather to remember Martha, who lived as a slave but died as a prophet, who called down powers to protect us because human law, human morality, human decency had all failed. We owe her everything, our freedom, our lives, our children's futures, and we promise to remember, to teach our children and their children what she did, what it cost, why it mattered." As he spoke, the entity manifested more clearly than it had in years, and this time, for the first time, it spoke not in judgment or warning, but in something approaching contentment. 30 years, 3 generations, still free, still flourishing, still remembering. Martha is pleased. I am pleased. The bargain holds, the watching continues, but hope exists here. Proof that change is possible, that evil can transform, that the oppressed can call forth justice when systems fail to provide it. The presence faded, and the gathered people stood in silence, feeling the weight of history, the complexity of what they'd built from suffering. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't undo what had been done, but it was something. Proof that Martha's desperate prayer in the cane fields had been answered, that her sacrifice meant something, that the entity she'd summoned had kept its word. Thomas died that night, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. Some said Martha came for him personally, that the spirits sang him across to whatever lay beyond. Others said he simply let go, satisfied that the work he'd stayed to do was finished. Nathaniel lived until 1899, serving as keeper of the shrine and teller of the stories until age 64. Before he died, he wrote a final addition to the history, a postscript for future generations. I have lived my entire life in the shadow of what Martha called forth. I have seen things no human should see, spoken with entities that predate humanity, witnessed the supernatural made manifest in everyday life. And I have learned this: power exists beyond what we acknowledge. Justice can come from sources we don't expect, and the oppressed have always had access to forces that the powerful didn't realize existed. Martha's story isn't about witchcraft or demons. It's about resistance, about a woman who'd lost everything finding a way to protect those who came after, about spiritual traditions that colonizers tried to destroy, but that survived in hidden places, waiting to be called upon by those desperate enough and faithful enough to make the attempt. The entity remains at Briar Hollow. I feel it every day, watching, judging, protecting. It will remain long after I'm gone, long after everyone alive now is dead. Because some acts echo eternally. Some wrongs are so profound that they require permanent guardianship to ensure they're never repeated. To future generations reading this, know that you are protected. Know that you are witnessed. Know that the blood and suffering of your ancestors was not in vain. They called down powers to guard you, and those powers answered. Live worthy of that protection. Live free. Live remembering both the horror that was and the transformation that came after. And sometimes, on quiet nights, go to Martha's shrine. Light a candle. Speak her name, thank her for what she did, and listen. You might hear her answer, might feel the presence of something vast and ancient and completely committed to ensuring that what happened here can become what happens everywhere. That slavery's end becomes permanent, that justice, however delayed, however costly, eventually prevails. This is not a story with a neat ending. Evil happened. Horror was called forth in response. Transformation occurred, but the cost remains, the debt unpaid, the watching eternal. Martha's entity doesn't sleep, doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. It simply is. Guardian and judge, protector and witness. The living embodiment of rage transformed into purpose, suffering transformed into power, death transformed into eternal vigilance. May it watch over you as it has watched over us. May you never need to call upon it as Martha did, but may you always know it's there, waiting, ready, should the forces of oppression ever forget what it means to face justice that doesn't compromise, doesn't negotiate, doesn't accept anything less than freedom for all. Nathaniel died the night after writing those words. They found him in the shrine, kneeling before Martha's altar, a smile on his face and his blind eyes reflecting candlelight in patterns that seemed almost like language, almost like symbols, almost like a final message to those who'd learned to read such things. Briar Hollow continued through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights era, always slightly separate, always protected by reputation and by reality from the worst of what surrounded it. The entity remained, growing quieter as years passed, but never absent, particularly on anniversaries. Martha's death, the night she called the power forth, Silas's transformation, it would manifest, reminding new generations of old promises, old protections, old debts never fully paid. In the 20th century, scholars came to study Briar Hollow as a unique case of successful land reform, of black community building, of resistance to oppression. They documented the oral histories, photographed the shrine, interviewed descendants. Some dismissed the supernatural elements as folklore, cultural memory distorted by time. Others saw deeper truth, that sometimes the only adequate response to systemic evil is something beyond the system, beyond normal human capacity, something that requires reaching into older powers, older ways of understanding justice. The shrine still stands. Martha's grave still refuses to grow grass, and on certain nights, particularly when someone in the community faces injustice or threat, shadows still move wrong, temperatures still drop impossibly. And something vast and patient still watches from just behind reality, keeping the bargain Martha made, protecting what she died protecting, waiting with eternal patience for the day when such guardianship might no longer be necessary. But that day hasn't come. Perhaps it never will, because some wounds cut too deep to fully heal, some evils echo too long to ever fully silence. And some prices, once paid in blood and suffering and desperate prayer, establish debts that stretch beyond individual lives, beyond generations, becoming permanent features of the landscape itself. Briar Hollow stands as testimony to suffering and survival, to evil and transformation, to the power of the oppressed when pushed beyond endurance, to the supernatural forces that still exist beneath the modern world, waiting to be called by those who remember the old ways, the old words, the old desperate prayers that work when nothing else will. And Martha watches over it all, not resting, never resting, because the work isn't finished. Won't be finished until the last chain is broken, the last master learns, the last victim receives justice. Until then, she remains. Part of the entity, part of the land, part of the eternal witness and guardian that was born the night she crawled into the cane fields and drew symbols in blood and called to powers that should have stayed dormant but answered anyway because her pain, her rage, her desperation was sufficient offering. They called her a witch. The slaves called her a prophet, and the South still calls it the mystery that should never have been awakened. But awakened it was. And what Martha summoned that night in 1839 has never left, will never leave, watching and waiting with patience that outlasts human lifespans, ensuring that at least one corner of a broken world stays mended, at least one community stays protected, at least one woman's sacrifice means something permanent and real and powerful enough to change not just the present, but the future itself. This is where the story ends for now. But the watching never ends. The entity never sleeps. And Martha's spirit, whether literally or metaphorically, continues its eternal vigil, ensuring that what was built from horror and transformation survives, ensuring that her people, all people who remember what it means to be owned, to be oppressed, to be treated as less than human, know that power exists to fight back, to protect, to ensure justice even when human systems fail. The shrine remains open, the candles burn on anniversaries. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully on quiet nights at Briar Hollow, you can still hear an old woman singing in a language older than English, older than the nation, older than the terrible systems that tried to break her, but instead became the catalyst for something neither masters nor slaves expected, proof that the oppressed can call down justice from sources the oppressors didn't know existed, and that justice once called never leaves, never forgives, never forgets. It only watches, remembers, protects forever,